And, if you think about it, consider, for instance, hypothetically, a Jewish person born in the 90s. To what extent does the Holocaust impact him? If he's going to go around and say that he's struggling because of the Holocaust, I think a lot of people would be very skeptical of that. They would say, maybe your parents, maybe your grandparents, but there's a certain amount of removal from in years from the crime that makes those kinds of claims less plausible. And that's just my opinion. I understand that that's controversial, but I don't see how it's not true.
This is a common misconception when talking about reparations. Normally, when we hear talk about reparations for blacks in the U.S., we talk about and stick to almost exclusively the barbaric practice of chattel slavery. This leaves an out for most people to say the obvious. You were never a slave, and nobody alive today ever legally owned a slave in the U.S. The discussion then devolves into, why should I have to pay for somebody who was never a slave, yada yada yada. Here's how I answered that question when a commenter commented something similar. Okay, so the video talks about reparations. Obviously, the token thinks having a government be held responsible for allowing the brutal structure of race-based chattel slavery under the system of white supremacy is pretty damn funny. I don't personally see the funny part in that, but I don't do his job. The video speaks for itself, but I want to point you to one of the comments. This was a comment that got a lot of likes and replies on this video. So the comment reads, why do people who were never slaves think people who never owned slaves owe them money? Like I said before, and at the risk of sounding redundant, I'll say it again. Some people just aren't nuanced. It seems, and this is just a personal observation, that they're normally the ones that espouse white supremacist talking points, but I'm sure that's just a coincidence. They only seem to understand simple concepts. If the concept gets too difficult, they won't get it. So in this case, the person thinks, why would anyone who never were slaves get any money from the people who never owned slaves? See, that's simple. A simple concept that anyone can understand. Again, it's easier to understand and move on with life if you're not nuanced. If you are nuanced, then that simplicity isn't enough with this topic. Here's a saying that can help the nuanced challenged in understanding this part. It may not be our fault, but it's our responsibility. I'll give you an example of what I mean. When a police officer violates the rights of a citizen and that citizen sues a jurisdiction where the officer is employed, who do you think pays a settlement to that citizen? Now, you or I didn't violate that person's rights. We weren't working as police officers. In fact, we had absolutely nothing to do with the violation that led to a lawsuit. However, we are responsible for paying that settlement through our taxes. The reason for that is simple, because we as citizens are responsible for the past actions, the current actions, and the future actions of our government. Got it? Well, good. Let's move on to this part then. Since the government, and that government, which is still around today, permitted a system based on white supremacy, the government is culpable for the results of that system. That system birthed race-based chattel slavery. That system birthed Jim Crow laws. That system birthed black codes and other laws, standards, or practices that targeted black people, and the results of which are still felt today. Furthermore, slavery is just one part of the depravity of that system. People seem to think it's the whole, and it's only a part. The system didn't go away when race-based chattel slavery was ended. After race-based chattel slavery ended, that's when the black codes, the Jim Crow laws, the practice of redlining, convict leasing programs, the vagrancy laws, practice of debt peonage, chain gangs, that's when that started. All disproportionately affecting black people.
I think in that case, probably it would be proper. And obviously it's a case-by-case basis, but the closer you are to the crime, the more plausible and morally required it is to give somebody reparations. And you always have to take into account the other side of the equation here, right? If my grandfather does something if your grandfather did something horrible to my grandfather, I couldn't necessarily come to you and expect you to pay me directly, right? That would be immoral. So obviously, the closer you are to the crime, you're exactly right. The more necessary, the more morally required it is, and it's a damn shame that reparations were not paid to recently freed slaves and their children. Unfortunately, it is a different situation we're dealing with today.
Here's yet another bad argument that opponents of reparations use. They present it in a false analogy as individuals paying other individuals for something their relatives have done. When you present it that way, it looks justifiably unfair. The reality of reparations in the United States is a government repairing. That's what reparations actually means. The damage it has done by allowing a system to unjustly harm its citizenry. So when we hear the reparations arguments, do not let it settle just on chattel slavery. It was the system of white supremacy that allowed for chattel slavery, but it did not stop after chattel slavery was ended.